So I bring you greetings this morning from those who work on my staff at the office of the bishop. But also this past week I was at the College for Bishops, also known as Baby Bishops School, a 3-year program that we attend. And one of our instructors this past week was Jeff Lee, who had been rector here a number of years ago. And he wanted me to send along his greetings as well. So there's an old adage for congregations that seems relevant for today's gospel lesson, and I was reminded of it when I was reading a commentary. It is this: the church is a hospital for sinners, not a museum for saints. The problem is that many of us like museums in their collections, right? Pieces of art that get lauded for their importance and beauty, their exquisiteness and sophistication. And I certainly count myself among their number. With the possible exception of the works of Banksy, we tend not to hold up graffiti in the same way that we would value a Monet. And so it is often with churches. We prefer displays of perfection in liturgy and art and music. We want them done well, and we appreciate the people assembled there too, rather than imagining what it would look like for a church to be a sick ward at a hospital. But not Jesus. As that same commentator put it, Jesus reminds us that like a hospital, a church is a place where many different people with many different needs come looking for help. It is not the well who need a physician, but the sick, said Jesus to the theological elites of his day, many of whom it seemed enjoyed looking down their noses at others less fortunate than themselves. A church is to be a place of healing, not a place rooted in perfection. This all started because Jesus saw Matthew sitting there at the tax booth and said to him, "Follow me." Tax collectors were despised then, probably as much as they are now, right? While in our day the IRS is regulated, back then people like Matthew would be told the tax figure that they needed to collect from the officials, and then they would add on top whatever they wanted to get their cut. Tax collectors were known to add on exorbitant amounts. And there was nothing that the locals could do because they were under the governance of an empire. So they just despised those people and paid. So when Jesus saw Matthew and said to him, "Follow me," you can bet that eyebrows were raised. And then Jesus is invited to Matthew's house for a dinner party with all of Matthew's pals. And that pushes all of the buttons on those religious types. They ask Jesus' followers why he eats with tax collectors and sinners, showing exactly what they thought about Matthew. And Jesus seems to have very sharp hearing because he's the one that responds to the question rather than his disciples. Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. For I have come to call not the righteous, but sinners. Which is an awful lot to unpack on a Sunday morning. For example, is Jesus calling those religious leaders righteous? Are they well? And if that's the case, then why tell them to go and learn what it means that God desires mercy rather than sacrifice? And what does mercy have to do with all of this anyway? And why is it more desirable than those sacrifices? None of us likes to be honest about our flaws. When we are asked that obligatory question about our weaknesses and growing edges, and yes, I was asked that question when I was applying to be bishop, we have a ready answer, right? That sounds more like a positive than a negative. In fact, you can go out there on the internet and find websites that show you how to answer this well. The authors of one of those sites claims this single question about your weakness has the power to determine in one swift blow whether you are a potential asset or a liability to a prospective employer. Wow. Of course, they strongly urge you not to say that your fault is that you work too hard or that you're a perfectionist, which feels like you aren't very self-aware, they say. Rather, you should pick a minor weakness that wouldn't disqualify you from the job, and then talk about how you intend to overcome it and how you've been working on that perceived weakness. Can you imagine if you were asked about your moral failings in the same way? Immediately, we would pull out the ways that we've done the opposite, right? Giving back to the community, for example, or our involvement at a parish. We wouldn't say, well, it's been a really hard week at work, and so I was a little beyond where I normally am, and I gave in to the following vices when I was tempted, and list them off. Not a chance, right? We want to be seen as perfect. It isn't the righteous that I've come to heal, but sinners, Jesus says. I suspect those religious leaders would have done well to learn how to be self-aware, not unlike religious leaders for centuries, says the guy who's a bishop. We do indeed have our own faults lying hidden in our hearts. Perhaps maybe it's anger or a self-righteous attitude or something else. There's no need really for us to speculate about it, just as I'm not going to lay out my shortcomings and sins with you this morning. But religious leaders should realize by now that their lives aren't perfect. That while they might not have been dealing with something very apparent out in front, maybe the moral equivalent of a significant laceration that needs stitches, that perhaps something's going on in the interior, akin to the hardening of arteries, something difficult to diagnose. Or maybe to put it another way, who here among us has never been to the doctor? Which of us has never needed medical assistance? Which brings us to Jesus' other statement to them. He says, "Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice." If you were paying attention this morning, you notice that in our reading from the prophet Hosea, there's a similar line. We heard, "For I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings." Three ideas to express the same thing that is desired by the Almighty instead of offering or sacrifices. Mercy, steadfast love, the knowledge of God. In Hosea, the prophet states that the people's love for God evaporates like the morning dew. It's fickle, their love. Jesus is saying the same thing to those religious types. You're not showing mercy the way that God intended. Your love is reserved for those who are in cahoots with you. And you're wrong about this. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus then goes on to show what that means in a very tangible way, beyond just having lamb and pita and hummus with some tax collectors. Immediately following that dinner, Jesus is touched by a woman who's been hemorrhaging for 12 years. She would have been unclean because of that, and her touch would have made Jesus unclean. He doesn't chastise her or get upset. Rather, he shows her mercy, steadfast love. He shows her the way of God. And then he goes from there to take the hand of a dead girl, also something forbidden by the religious purity laws, restoring her to life and giving her back to her family, simply because he chose compassion. He embodied the love of God. That direction of the love of God is always toward the marginalized, the despised, and the outcasts. And the medicine for those ailments is always the same, showing kindness and mercy and love. Because we know that love can do amazing things. It is easy to find before and after photos of animals online that have been treated cruelly, to see what happens to them after they receive a bit of love and attention. It's a night and day difference. I saw a goldfish, friends, with dark black splotches around its body that after a few weeks of careful attention returned to a brilliant gold. Dogs that have been ill-treated or thin and scared that are smiling with tails wagging and fuller coats and bodies. Pets rescued from harmful situations flourish once they receive love. As do we all. Because that's the very thing that we long for more than anything else, right? Mercy and love, rather than judgment and hate. Churches are called to be those places of love. To show both on the outside and on the in that our mission is to exhibit mercy. And that love goes both ways. We show our love for God in how we care for the people who worship here, and also in how we exhibit that love to those outside of our communities. It is easy to get focused in on singular items within worshiping communities. Be it how to have perfect music, perhaps, or how you might need more money for a budget, or something else. But we are called to be a house of love and mercy. A place that knows the way of God. And when we shift our focus from an inward one to those who are outside of our walls, well, you can see the night and day difference. And we become more fully the followers of Jesus. So friends, be that place. Be those people, recognizing that all of us need compassion. Because that's the thing that those religious types miss most of all. They needed that love too. Far too often, those who are not in need in this life think that somehow they have it all together. But that does not exempt them from the desire to be known and loved for who they are, so that they might blossom and flourish. Too many times while I was a rector at a parish, people would come up to me and talk about having a difficult time, but then say that they're not going to be in church for a while because they didn't want the mask to slip. They wanted the lives that they had to be out there and not to be judged because of whatever was going on in their lives. Those people on the margins are far more ready to admit their need of Jesus. He makes it clear that love and mercy of God can transform each one of us. Let us become even more boldly a place of love where all are welcomed and accepted and invited into God's story. May this place be a church that chooses mercy and steadfast love and truly embraces the call to live just like Jesus did. May it be so. Amen.